Alright, our last video here on naming compounds, and here we're going to try and put all the rules that we've learned together. We also have to just finish naming a couple fairly trivial things that weren't included in any of the other videos. So first of all, remember that metals often occur in nature as elements. So when we want to name metals, all we do is we state the name of the metal, and then we include the word metal. So for example, zinc occurring as a solid in nature would be zinc metal. Next, noble gases are diatomic gases, single elements that exist on their own as a gas. The name of them is just the name of the element followed by gas. So the first one here would be neon, gas, and second of all, fluorine, gas. Finally, I'm not going to ask you to know a whole lot of common names, but there are three that I think you should know. Water, I'm sure you know, is H2O. Methane is CH4. And ammonia is NH3. There's no reason for those names. Well, there is a reason for methane, but you don't need to understand the reasons for those names. Those are three that you're just expected to know. Okay, so let's do some practice where we do all these together. And let's put together an approach that will help us get this right. So the first question you're going to ask yourself is element or compound. If it's an element, then we're going to say metal or gas. So metal is like zinc metal, and gas is like neon gas or oxygen gas. So here we might have noble gases or generally diatomic gases. So a noble gas or a diatomic gas. So those are the elements that generally we're dealing with. You can have some other elements that just get their own name, so I guess I should include those. So just stuff like non-metals that can exist on their own, where you can have carbon or sulfur or silicon. Some of these guys will just exist like on their own, C or S or Si. And we just call them what they are in that case. Okay, if it's a compound, we're going to have a whole list of issues here. The first thing we're going to look at is the first element. In the first element, we have three possible options. If it's a metal, if it's a non-metal, or if it's hydrogen. So if it's a metal, we have to ask ourselves one more question. Is it multivalent? If the answer here is yes, then we're going to say metal, bracket, bracket, and here we could have the non-metal or polyatomic. And if the answer here is no, then we just get the metal and the non-metal or polyatomic. But we don't include a Roman numeral in any way. If the first element's a non-metal, then we're going to use our covalent compound naming system, specifically our prefixes. And finally, if the first element is hydrogen, then we're dealing with our acids. So we have to ask ourselves, do we have a binary or oxyacid? If it's a binary, then we use hydro, then we have the name of the nonmetal, and then we add ic acid, and if it's an oxy, we start with the name of the, that means we have a polyatomic, so we start with the name of the polyatomic, where 8 goes to ic acid, and ite goes to us acid. Okay, I just paused there because I could hear a lot of fan noise and I thought that might be distracting. So there it is. There's our big chart that tells us, oh, I gotta pause for one more second here. There's our big chart that shows us all how to name stuff that we've learned so far. So step number 1, element or compound. If it's an element, then we can just name nonmetals with their name, carbon, sulfur, silicon. They don't need anything else. If it's a metal, we go zinc metal, gold metal, copper metal, iron metal, something like that. And if it's a diatomic gas or a noble gas, then we say the name of the element, gas. So neon gas, oxygen gas, fluorine gas, hydrogen gas, something like that. If it's a compound, we look at the first element. If the element's a metal, we go into the multivalent, or the next thing we do is it multivalent? If it's multivalent, then we put the valence in brackets in between, metal, non-metal. Remember, we're changing the ending to IDE there. And then, or if it's a polyatomic, metal, brackets, then polyatomic. If it's not multivalent, like any of the ones in the first two columns, then we don't include the brackets at all. If the first element's a non-metal, then we're dealing with a covalent compound, and so we use that prefix system that we covered in a previous video. And if the first element's hydrogen, then is it a binary acid or an oxyacid? If it's a binary acid, we call it hydrochloric, bromic, fluoric, whichever one, acid. And if it's got a polyatomic, that makes it an oxyacid. If the end of the polyatomic is 8, then we go with ic, so sulfuric, phosphoric, chloric acid. And if the ending is ite, it could be sulfurous or sulfurous acid, for example. That gets us our ite. So here's our big list, and let's use our thing and figure it out. So first one, element of compound, that's a compound. The first one's a metal, it's lithium, and lithium is not multivalent. So we get down here, and we call that one lithium, no brackets, not multivalent, carbonate. Fe, standing by himself. He's an element. He's a metal. That's iron metal. N2O4, that's a compound. The first element is a nonmetal, which means we're using our prefix system. Dinitrogen, tetra oxide. HCl, it's a compound. First element, hydrogen. It's a binary acid. So that becomes hydrochloric acid. CO2, compound. First element is covalent. So CO2, we don't put the mono on the first element, so that's just carbon dioxide. CuSO4, that's a compound. The first element is a metal. That metal is copper. Copper is multivalent, so yes. So copper, leaving the brackets, that polyatomic SO4 is sulfate. Being very careful with what goes in those brackets, I'm going to write CuSO4, and then I'm going to go sulfate was 2 minus. So what must have the charge on copper have been? If I imagine this being a 1-to-1 ratio, then this must have been a 1-to-1 ratio, so that must have been 2 plus. So that's copper to sulfate. That's probably the trickiest thing in this whole thing. Compound, first element is a metal. It's sodium. Sodium is not multivalent. So this is a metal and a polyatomic. So this is sodium. No brackets here, not multivalent. Hydroxide. Xe is an element. It's a gas. It happens to be one of the noble gases. That would be xenon gas. And finally, H3PO4 compound. First element is hydrogen, and that is an oxyacid. And so we're stuck going down here. The corresponding polyatomic is phosphate. So the 8 changes to the ic acid, so this is phosphoric acid. So that's it. That's all we need to do for naming, and that's lots of stuff to practice.